Welcome to this episode of Let's Talk Data. Today we talk about ransomware, but from a backup perspective. What is the best way to avoid having your backups maliciously attacked? We discuss the role of immutability, what isolation can do, and whether we're doomed to using tape stored in Antarctica. Our guests today are Tony Gent, Product Manager for Availability and Protection at Proact, and Rick Vanover, Senior Director of Product Strategy at Veeam, obviously. Yeah. So hope you learn a lot and enjoy the show. So, welcome to this episode. With COVID slowly, gaining stability or stabilizing around the world, and with people getting vaccinated, we are slowly starting to see the light in the end of the tunnel. But there's another pandemic that's been raging, much longer than the COVID pandemic, and that's the one regarding ransomware. All over the world, especially in the Western world, companies within all business areas are getting targeted, getting their business critical data encrypted, and held hostage for a fee. This has been going on for so long now that I'd be amazed if there's one IT manager out there that doesn't have ransomware as their biggest fear. And so, what do you do to protect yourself from these ill-minded organizations that only want to breach your security and extort you? What do you say, Rick?
Well, I think that it's really something that comes up in every conversation. I can tell you, Nico, I've gone through so many conversations. We want to talk about this, but we always end up talking about that. Meaning, let's talk about enterprise apps, but ransomware always comes up. It's truly an unavoidable topic. It comes into every conversation. I research it a lot. I read every article. I talk to users and partners that deal with it every day. And I really pivot all those learnings and the advice and the story that I take out to market. So it's real.
Yeah, and I think it's actually quite interesting that certainly when I go around to talk to customers and throughout the years, everyone has their own horror story about it. Everyone knows somebody else that's been affected, and there are lots of them, and they're growing a lot. So I think the actual process for it being it's increasing, and its severity is increasing. I think it's the level of damage that it can do is increasing also.
What do you mean by that, Tony? Like with the severity, I guess, getting your business critical data encrypted.
Yeah, I think what used to happen maybe with ransomware was the fact that you'd get a bot, you'd gain a piece of malware, probably by email or via USB stick or something on those lines, and then on one Friday it would ravage your network, and then over the weekend it would encrypt all of your data, and then you come in on Monday morning and oh no, everything's gone completely Pete Tong. But it's becoming much more these days of a proactive thing that happens over a longer period of time. Mm-hmm. So we're finding that people who are performing the ransomware are being a lot more calculating, and they're doing it over weeks, months. So that it's very difficult then for the organization to A, defend against it, and B, to bring back from it without actually paying the ransom.
Mm-hmm. Because they've encrypted the backups as well, or...
Well,
go Rick.
No, they can. And you're right, Tony. These threats are more than just script kiddies nowadays, because if they're going to go in and look, the first thing they're going to look to do is disable the defense mechanisms, right? So they're going to start disabling the antivirus, anti-malware tools. They're going to start escalating privileges if they can, right? So the script kiddie is like this, I say script kiddie, but these like simple encryptors, that's how it started. But now there is this elevated level of competency, honestly, by these threat actors, where they will go after the defense mechanisms, everything from anti-malware to backups and more. And so, what I look at is having to be one step ahead of and two layers defended upon, right, with these types of threat actors. So you're right, Tony. And if you think about USB drives, that's basically being walked in through the gate of sorts. If you think about remote access done wrong, if you think about phish email, and then also the dark horse number 3 mode of entry is updates not being done, right? So exploiting vulnerabilities. And so for the listeners, those three things, if you can execute on those the way IT should be, you're hitting like 97, 95% efficacy of the entry modes of some of these threats. And then, of course, that smaller band of what does get through, they're always more intense, right? So you want to then have additional layers. But you're right, Tony, for sure.
One of the things that we traditionally, when we tend to sort of set up security to defend ourselves against anything to do with computers, it tends to be we utilize technology to do it. So we put in firewall to protect us from the internet. We put in application protection to protect against sort of people attacking our applications, denial of service attacks, things of that nature. But one of the different elements with regard to the way that ransomware works is we're almost assuming that the other person is actively trying to work against us. So we end up with a situation where they've made it into our network, they've elevated privileges, just as Rick says, they've gained a foothold, they may have admin access to our domain, and they've done all of this before they've actually done any encryption. They haven't done that yet. They're doing that later on, but they're gaining this extra degree of access, and they've also, as part of that process, they then put in their own backdoors, their own methods to get into your network, their own ways of attacking you. So if you're defending yourself against this sort of bad actor, it's not simply going up against a program. You're actually going up against somebody who is actively working against you.
Right.
And that's a really strong situation for them to be in. And it means that from the users and from the business's perspective, it makes it extremely difficult, and they have to be very proactive about the way that they protect against it.
Is that we went into a kind of a different stages, or how a ransomware attack normally maybe goes from A to B to C to done.
Yeah.
Would you like to expand on that?
We've covered them a little bit, but yeah, I would say, generally speaking, the methods of attack that we're seeing at the moment, and this changes. But at the moment, the initial attack is them, once they've gained access to your network, they scan the network infrastructure, so they understand exactly how the network works. So they're doing a discovery on your network. They then utilize either internal tools or tools that they bring with them, because they can utilize PowerShell, they can utilize internal scripting engines. And they can utilize those things to then gain access, steal passwords to your domain, gain entry into specific smaller programs. From there, they can then create domain accounts, gain higher permissions, elevate their access to your network. And from there, having gained access to your domain, they then start executing files, and then they'll start putting in these backdoors for persistent access to allow them back into the network if you discover them. And from that point, the next key one, and this is the one that maybe people don't necessarily understand, is they then work to delete your backups. And that's the key element, because ransomware is no good. Encrypting it is no good if you can just recover it from the backup. So the backup then becomes the next point of attack. And once that happens, then they then start encrypting your files. Mm-hmm. So about 6 separate methods, 6 separate stages of the attack process, but all of them essentially put the business in a more difficult, more compromised situation to each one. Right.
And as Rick said, this is not normally done anymore by script kiddies or hobbyists. In our security episode, we talked a lot about these organized crime syndicates that drive around in Lamborghinis and go into retirement after a couple of years only, because it's so lucrative. So there are big companies doing this apparently. Rick, anything to add to that?
Yeah, so I'm always thinking about, okay, how do I break it? Right? How do I break the model? How do I break the threat? And the reality today is immutability, right? That is kind of every conversation, like I mentioned, it's having your data kept with immutability in mind. And then you have to also be ready to handle other threats like extortion and things like that, right? Which that's a whole nother, maybe that's the next episode, right? But the immutability conversation, I go into this more immutability or more immutability debate. And what I mean by that is a lot of times people are like, oh, I need 6 months of immutable data. And I'm like, I don't know. It's not really that helpful. if you went back to 6 months ago, might as well just call it. It's not going to be.
Okay, let's define that before we go into it more. I've heard a lot of talks about immutability, and what is immutability? First of all?
You're one of the many people asked me to stop on that, because I was once chatting with someone who was an English major, and they're like, "Is that even a word?" And yes, it is a word. So let's define it. It means data in this context. It's data that's not capable of being altered. So deleted, modified, etc. That's the simplest way to explain it. Maybe read-only with authority is another way to say it.
Mm-hmm. A secret runestone.
Yeah,
in the
I
woods.
like that. Yeah,
something like that. Okay.
And so with this immutable copy, it is I've actually made another word, making words, the Rictionary. I made a word called ultra-resilient storage. And so when I say ultra-resilient, that is a family of storage techniques that include immutable, that include offline, that include air-gapped, things like that. Because each of them have their own durability characteristics that can help you in a ransomware recovery scenario. And I'll go one better, guys, and say, I know it's 2021, but tape media that's marked as worm and removed from a library is all three of those at once. It's immutable, it's offline, and it's air-gapped. I mean, that's a very resilient specimen. Okay, I'm not saying everybody divert to tape, because a lot of people want the cloud. They want immutability in the cloud storages and on-prem unified storages that offer it. But when you think about immutability, it can exist also in Linux file systems. And that's the story I tell about more immutability, say 6 months, or more immutability, say 2 copies that are immutable, because we're supposed to have 2 copies anyways. And the thought is, I want to put 1 copy on an immutable Linux file system, and then I'll put another copy in an immutable cloud target with 2 different storage control planes, with 2 different immutability logics, one of those being off-site. You really have really strong confidence that you can recover data in those situations, right? So that's where I'm kind of drifting the conversation to, and it's so easy to do now. It just has to be done. That's
right.
kind of my advice that I take to market today.
Right.
I've got to say, there are 2 things there. Firstly, one of the key elements with regard to immutability, which is the fact that even the administrator can't delete it. And I think that's the key point, because we're assuming here that somebody who's gained access to your network has also gained access to your backup solution. And on the basis of that, then in theory, they can be they are your backup administrator. So they could, in theory, delete your backups. But the key point with immutability is the fact that even that administrator can't delete their backups. You can't delete your own data. So it is very strong from that perspective. Rick and I probably disagree about tape. I've had fire safes. I've used Iron Mountain. At the end of the day, all these other things. I don't want to go back there, but and I think tape still has something to offer, but in reality, probably only over a very short period of time. But I'm with you completely, Rick, with regard to the cloud object storage. I think cloud object is the new tape. It is sort of write once, read only. It is encrypted. It is far more durable than tape is, and I think that is the way that we should be moving these things forward. And it's also cheaper. So tape's good, but we probably slightly disagree on that.
I'll raise your cheekiness here, Tony. Okay, so everyone has a story of tape letting them down. Including me. I won't disagree with that. So I'm not pivoting the advice, but sometimes I'll talk to organizations that can't handle cloud. Nope, not for me. Okay? Yeah. So there's that persona out there too, right? So then when I think about immutable Linux file systems or offline storages, and you need to have options that include other things. And then the other thing I'll say is that when I look at the object storage immutability, you're exactly right. The administrator can't delete it. Funny story. I was doing a demo once when we first launched this a couple years ago for the public cloud. And I just, look at this. I can make this immutable for 90 days. Guess what? I put it back up there. On day 91, I had to go and delete it because I couldn't delete it. I mean, I could call the cloud provider and nuke my account or whatever, but these types of immutability characteristics are pretty authoritative. So, be careful with more immutability in regards to times. I had to wait 3 months to delete that data. So I've been cranking it down to like 2 weeks now.
But in more places.
Yeah, exactly. More places and more out of band ways to get out of the problem. Secret weapon stuff there.
Yeah, no, and I think that's the other key element is the ransomware will only ever be on your network. So it'll have access to everything that you have access to. But if you are to use an external provider of some description, be that, Proact, obviously we do backup as a service, and that's a good example. So is utilizing cloud storage like AWS and Azure. So is utilizing SaaS providers to a certain extent. But the key element is the fact that once the data is outside of your network, it is then no longer able to be attacked by that particular ransomware attack. And actually that isolation from your systems is probably, and no disrespect to Rick here, it's probably more powerful than immutability. Because immutability is great from the point of view of storing data locally and for holding onto that data locally, and it can't be deleted. But having it off your network as well is probably better, just slightly.
Yeah, 100%.
So
100%.
Yeah, it's really important.
Multiple domains,
to get the data away.
Domains of administration, domains of failure. These are good principles, and a real simple one is when you have the software as a service model. There's a control plane that, from the customer perspective, really isn't yours. And that is good because it is a good separation. And then if you think about backup as a service offerings, those are secret weapon things because this is, I'm going to go into a hole here because this is one of my most consistent observations of ransomware response. A lot of organizations can't restore back to where they came from. Think of the like a digital equivalent of like police tape wrapped around the data center because there might need to be an investigation of what happened. That is something a lot of people don't think about. They might have immutable copies for days, but if you can't go back to where you came from, then you have a new problem and you didn't plan for it. So the software as a service offerings, when you think about cloud models, and it doesn't have to always be Azure, AWS in the lot. When you think about these service provider offerings, if I'm an end user and I'm stuck, service providers can give me IaaS and restore and carry on. Because again, I may not be able to come back to where I started because of investigations, digital forensics. I debriefed a story of a organization that digital forensic process was 3 weeks. So think about that virtual yellow
tape.
That's
worse than ransomware.
That is worse, right? But the other thing is you don't want to be in a situation of do we solve root cause? Do we solve who is responsible and what happened? Do we get answers to those questions or do we get our business back up and running? You don't want to be in that situation either, right? Yeah. So the organization restored to a service provider on an IaaS platform, the top third, 2/3 of what they needed, and they carried on within hours. That's the expectation today.
And also you got to assume that you have been infected. You have got ransomware attacking your network. You don't know as the IT department where it lives. It could be on a workstation sitting in a completely separate office that you weren't aware of. So what do? Do you wipe everything? You've got to turn it all off in the event of a ransomware attack anyway, but when do you turn it back on? And how dare you turn it back on knowing that it may then reinfect your network? So this concept of taking your backups and saying, right, there's a service provider, Proact do infrastructure as a service over here, let's restore this into PHC. And by performing that operation, we're bringing it up on a completely isolated network with no access to the customer's other data. And the customer can start their key business services back up and running. Without the worrying about the fact that they'll turn on one machine and it will then reinfect the entire network again.
PHC, private hosted cloud?
Proact hybrid cloud, but yes, thank you.
Okay, even better.
Yeah, but that's a very good selling point. I mean, don't want to go too much into product here, but when we talk about Proact hybrid cloud, we often see it as your local safe public cloud where you can experiment or develop and so on with connections to the big hyperscalers. But it's also, as you mentioned there, Tony, a very good safe, not just it's a backup of your infrastructure in case the worst happens to get you back into. I've never really thought about it that way.
A safe restore point, I suppose, is the key point, isn't it? And again, isolated from your primary network. So again, we're talking about this degree of separation that you need in the event of an attack.
Clean
room
room restore. That's another word I've heard.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, absolutely. That's a good word.
So this is really talking about what happens when you get ransomware attacked. Like how can you get back to your business? We've had the episode about security talking about how can I avoid, which is almost not really possible to avoid, but how can I minimize the risks of getting ransomware attacked in the beginning? But I think this is even more important, obviously, as the villains seem to always be one step ahead of us, right? And so how can I best get back into business when that happens? Because it's really not a matter of if always, it's a matter of when. It's what I've heard at least.
Well, no, I think you have to protect against it, assuming that's the case. I think certainly in the UK, the NCSC, the National Cybersecurity Centre, state that you have to assume that you're going to get it. It's not like, oh, it might happen. It's going to happen now. What will you do if you are? You've got to be designing your network, designing your infrastructure, thinking about that sort of stuff in mind.
Self-isolate, so to speak.
Yes, exactly.
Your data backups.
Exactly. Sadly, they don't do computer face masks, but I'm sure they're coming.
Yeah, exactly.
Vaccination. That's what we need.
But so isolation, immutability, perhaps utilizing external targets with separate networks. Is that the conclusion here in how to best manage your backups from a ransomware protection perspective?
I would also throw in access control. I think there's a lot of stuff these days with regard to two-factor authentication and privilege access management, and both of those things. Again, if we're assuming that you're attacked and somebody gains access to your network, we're therefore also assuming they've got access to your domain and therefore access to all your files and where somebody may have written down the password for X, Y, and Z. But if you're utilizing two-factor authentication where you need a key fob or a Google thing on your phone, or privilege access management, which is another online method of doing a very similar thing, where you require additional information to be able to gain password access, those things break their ability to be able to get into your environment. So actually, identity management is just as important really in that respect, because it protects the way that you store your data and it protects the password so that they can't gain access.
Cool.
I've got a few pieces of advice too, and I really like everything you hit there, Tony. But I have like one kind of post-implementation must-have, and that is one or more copies of immutable data. And I would also include Veeam Cloud Connect as an option, because the insider protection technology, that does meet my criteria of being ultra resilient. So, even if you can't do the public cloud, if, tape isn't your thing, you fancy a service provider, you can do it that way too. But then I have three very important front end recommendations. Number one, make a response plan. If you are in the mindset, hopefully we've convinced you that everyone will have to deal with this at some point. Where I see a lot of organizations falling down is that response plan. So number one, give some thought to it. Get to your stakeholders, think about DR, think about as a service options, etc. Number two, invest in user training. This is very important, because I would argue so many inbound incidents of ransomware could be traced back to user error, procedures not being followed, awareness, especially on spam email, those minor threats, but they could seed bigger threats, by the way. And then the third thing, this is probably the one that'll get people yelling at me and throwing things at me at Twitter, is really, especially for the critical data lakes and the components that touch them, like backup and other things, ask yourself a real serious question. Do those things need internet access? Because if everything has access to the internet, that makes it really easy for the threat actors to dwell, seek, discover, destroy. So I'm actually getting into the mindset of deconnectifying things. I think that's another layer of resiliency that I think should be kind of amplified. when you think about some of the remote control threat actors and supply chain distributions and things like that. So those are three kind of high level things that I'd want to bring up.
I'd agree, and to embellish that, I think some of the guidance that we're seeing out of Europe with regard to this sort of thing is network isolation for key systems. So, and one of the most key system in that situation is going to be your backup solution. So there has been historically, certainly in large organizations, the premise of having a separate network for backup. And that happened a little bit with VMware as well, but that was more down to bandwidth to try and stop it interfering with your live systems. But now we're getting to the stage whereby really there's an argument for having backup, maybe not on the domain, maybe in a completely separate subnet that is only accessible via its agents and only accessible via jump boxes that specific administrators have access to, that again have IDs that are off the network. So you're ending up with having isolation for your backup environment within your own network. So there's a lot of, certainly for larger organizations, that's a very valid way of trying to make sure that you're isolating off your backup environment from possible attack. Because even if they make it onto that primary subnet, they don't necessarily gain access to the second one.
Tony, you actually just outlined a recipe that we haven't spoken about prior, but I'll anecdotally reference one of my good friends based in Canada, works as an IT consultant in the energy and gas industry. And they drove a complete ransomware recovery scenario. They had backups in the cloud, great. But the interesting thing is this particular remote site where that happened was a Hyper-V environment. And the worst thing you could ever do with Hyper-V is have domain administrator used for all the things, right? Ransomware loves themselves a good propagation account. So they recovered all their data, which was great. But when they re-implemented and made changes post-incident, that right there, what you described, was very critical. They had a separate, lack of a better word, management domain for the Hyper-V infrastructure, and then yet a separate one for the backup infrastructure. And then those two were separate, no connectivity at all to the actual workloads that they were protecting. And then it propagated through the storages and through different management fabrics. But as much isolation as possible. What you just described there is exactly a post-incident change that was made by someone who drove complete recovery, but identified what they needed to do differently. And I'll pivot that to say that it gets specific quick. The Hyper-V example isn't common, right? Maybe VMware is more common, or some cloud workloads, or different enterprise apps, Linux, and things like that. So, I think to pivot that to practical advice, proactively, you should talk to people that can help you with that, because whether it's Veeam and our partners like you guys, you can drive those specific recommendations because it gets specific quick. We've talked about a lot of things. Those are the differences that make the difference.
Yeah, absolutely. Essentially, you're doing that sort of thing. You almost become your own backup as a service provider, isn't it? Which is quite a nice way of thinking about it. I know. A few years ago, there was this concept of the fact that IT departments should be selling their services to their internal customers, and it's very much following that sort of methodology.
True. So, Rick, you obviously travel the whole of the U.S. talking to customers, talking to partners. You're a knowledge bank of what to do, what not to do. I'd love to hear some anecdotes, worst case customers that you've talked to, or what you did not do, so to speak, from real life.
I travel the U.S. I'll be in Europe next week, but I've harvested the world to get. I've been at Veeam 11 years on the product team, so I'll run a whole bunch of them here by you. So let's go with 4, and then tell me to stop if you want more.
Okay.
I'll tell you this about Veeam and backups, and to an extent virtual environments as well. And I haven't yet seen this manifest itself in the cloud, but this is a little anecdote that our support team has said. They've said that Veeam is a lot like a bicycle. Your experience is 100% predicated on the terrain in which you use it. Have you ever tried to ride a bike in sand? It's not fun. So where I'm going with that is, if you have a suboptimal production environment, your backup and restore capability will follow. Think about responding to something serious, right? So good design predicates good recovery. So that's my one lesson learned. Number 2 is scoping this into the ransomware world. The 3-2-1 rule, gotta have it. We've at Veeam been telling this story. Let me back up. I'm here all week, friends. The 3-2-1 rule says that you should have 3 different copies of data on 2 different media, with one of them being off-site. Give yourself bonus points with 1 or more of those being immutable, offline, or air-gapped. That recipe was initially born in the digital photography world, about storing, once digital became like a thing, between cards and computers and stuff like that. It was a good way not to lose the photos. Works perfectly in enterprise IT, in the sense of it doesn't require any specific technology, yet it can handle nearly any failure scenario, including ransomware, when you include the immutable options. Make no mistake, when I talk to our support team, I'm here in the Veeam Central Ohio office, and we have our support team based here. I talk to them every 2 weeks with a debrief of what's working, what's not working, what's the advice that needs to go to the market about ransomware recovery. For 2 years, it has consistently been that organizations are not following the 3-2-1 rule. That is the problem of not being able to drive recovery. Third knowledge nug that I'll drop is that you have to align to a framework. When you think about the different security authorities, Tony mentioned the one in the UK. Here in the US, I like the NIST cybersecurity framework. Align to these frameworks in everything you do. Backup, IT, user training, and more. Real simply, they work across all the disciplines. And if you get a mindset involved, I like to say everybody is on the cybersecurity team. And if everybody's thinking about that, you'll get this collective body of motion that'll it'll reduce the risk. Herd immunity, right? It'll reduce the risk footprint. And my 4th piece of knowledge here is to just really ask questions with the stakeholders, because we have a different problem potentially of, I didn't know that was production. I thought these people playing with Kubernetes, I didn't think we were using that for anything significant, So knowing what we have to handle how we respond, that response plan is so important. And I'm actually very worried about that nowadays. I do come into the office, but I worry about, not everybody does, but that's another group. I don't talk to the storage team. I don't talk to the apps team. Us versus them, not going to work anymore, right? So have those conversations with the stakeholders, know where the data is, know what apps are being used, because Kubernetes, I don't have an example of somebody having a ransomware incident and, I forgot that Kubernetes was part of the problem. But what is dev? What is prod? Do we know what the people are doing? I don't know, So those types of
Shadow IT.
Shadow IT. Actually, true story. I spoke with an organization who referred to this other group. Their name was Shadow IT. Like, we're trying to get them to move over to this cloud. I'm like, it just sounds risky, right? So kind of avoid those barriers. That's my last knowledge nug.
Cool. Thank you, Rick. Tony, any comments on that?
Actually, to be honest, 2 things really. Firstly, with regard to keeping your stakeholders involved, I think one of the other key elements here is certainly IT departments tend to do security in the IT department, and I think quite often the group management or the team management will not necessarily be involved in that process and will not necessarily understand it because it's quite complicated and there's a lot going on and there's a lot of different threats out there. But I think certainly the one piece of advice that I'd be giving to IT managers is get a meeting with your managing director, your financial director, your CIO, and point out to them about the fact that this isn't nice to have. This isn't, we want one of these because it will provide us an extra 5% of protection. The key point here is if we get hit, how much is it going to cost the business? And the IT manager isn't really in a position to understand that. the IT manager doesn't know what sort of an impact it would have on the business for the business to be shut down for a week or 2 weeks trying to recover from a ransomware attack. And actually, that's where there really needs to be a conversation, because it's entirely possible that the business can't survive that, and the IT manager may not know. And I think it's really important to get the management teams involved in that process.
True. Rick, do you think that there are many management teams not understanding the threat ransomware is today?
You know, if we were having this conversation a year or two ago, maybe, but I think business leaders are absolutely asking those questions. And the practical advice to the IT community is you have to live beyond the SLA, because it's more than just, okay, recover, right? Now you got to talk. There might be cybersecurity response. There's a whole other contentious, unclear, inconsistent worldwide point of view on reporting an incident, right? So again, the preparation, prepare to deal with this with your stakeholders, and who would you call from a cybersecurity response point of view? You know, back to that response, I've spoken to some organizations who were not well prepared. They lost a day just trying to determine what to do. Okay, that's crazy, right? So one step further, I have seen, at least in North America, like cities, states, local government, they actually have established incident response groups and plans, and that's a good model that really the private sector can adopt as well. So really give some thought to that, because it's more than just an SLA at this point.
So we're around, Halloween is fast approaching. What sends a chill down your spines as professionals in the area of backup? What's really spooking you out, so to speak?
Primarily ransomware, I think, for me at the moment. I'm just trying to think that there's anything. I think to a certain extent, backup doesn't necessarily scare me, other than ransomware. And we've been through the many things that are causing that. I think disaster recovery probably scares me a little bit more than that at the moment. Whereby I still think there's a situation whereby a lot of businesses maybe aren't prepared, and I think that's something that, in the event that the bonfire doesn't just end at the local playing field and ends up on your business instead. I think it's one of those situations where that's something that a lot of businesses treat as being a second class or something that's a nice to have rather than a requirement. I think that's probably something they should be changing.
A spooky observation of sorts on my end is that we've had the newsworthy incidents a lot of times. They will align to something significant, like a holiday. I actually was briefed about one ransomware scenario where an organization had an incident, and it was right before something very visible and public was going to happen at that organization. So again, the threat actors know. And if you think about the alignment to holidays or to milestones, I think that's almost predicating a hurried response, right? So whatever's important to you, or whether it be holidays, milestones, those are things to watch. And so again, we have to prepare. We have to basically prepare to deal with this. But I actually have a question. Do you guys celebrate Halloween in Europe? I thought that was a North American special.
It was,
No.
and now it's here too, at least in Sweden.
Oh no, it's all over the UK. To be honest, it was my favorite holiday when I was younger, from the point of view that you get to dress up and with glasses on, with red eyes and that sort of stuff, and scare small children. I was a small child at the time, I just hasten to add.
Well, I think we're running out of time, and I want to thank you, Rick Vanover and Tony Gent, for being with us at Let's Talk Data, talking about ransomware, backup, and everything in between, and how to do it the right way. Thank you, guys. It's been a pleasure.
Cheers. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, cheers.
And the scene.